Welcome back to another Human First AI Marketing Podcast. I'm your host, Mike Montague. My guest this week is Alex Schlager, founder of AIceberg. And it's really hard not to throw the extra A in there, or I in there, Alex. But we're going to be talking about just the top of the AI security iceberg this week, because we can only scratch the surface in about 30 minutes. But I got an awesome expert for you here this week. You can find them at AIceberg.ai, and it's all things, especially enterprise security here. So, Alex, my first question to you is, how do we put humans first in the security side of things? Because I think there's two sides to that coin. One, humans are your biggest security risk at the moment. And then number two, we also want to design our system so that the humans can still do their work, protect the humans, and not exploit them, right? Is that a balancing act you see with enterprise companies?
Oh, it definitely is. So first of all, thank you for having me, Mike. Great to be on your show. And I think balancing act is a good way to describe it. The first confusion we always try to untangle is the difference between AI security and securing AI. So we see a lot of AI moving into, let's call them legacy security functions, where your SOC, your SIEM, or any other, legacy security functions are being upgraded or being enabled, with increasingly with AI. Securing AI itself is, providing safety and security for what we call AI events. And we call them AI events mostly because of agentic AI. So 8, 9, 10 months back, right, it was all about the chatbot, we call it user to machine. So user directly interacting with a machine, prompt and response. But now, the AI event landscape has significantly broadened with agentic AI, where you will see things like agent to agent, agent to memory, MCP for model context protocol, other tool invocations, and so on and so forth. So I think the big difference is the potential risk and impact that, an error or a breach, and often it's not immediately clear on the onset whether it's breach induced or error induced, is significantly higher in agentic than in a chatbot. I had a customer tell us, literally, he said, look, if the chatbot swears at my customer, it's not great, but it's not the end of the world. If an agentic flow of a critical process goes rogue, it's a completely different story. So to the last part of your question, we a lot of customers we work with heavily invest into human in the loop, both human in the loop and memory. So what this means is they will start moving a legacy process, which is either human driven or human and tool driven, to agentic AI. But the design itself in the early stages has a human in the loop interface, which means every time the agent carries out a critical task, it will wait for the human in the loop to basically confirm that it is allowed to move forward. That's the first part. The second part is dynamic learning. So as the human in the loop provides feedback to the agent ideally, if it's designed properly, will basically add memory, short-term, long-term memory, to continuously improve. So what you will see is these agentic flows being run 10, 100 of times, with humans providing feedback, both to the developers and the agent itself for memory assembly, up to a point where they will say, we feel confident that this agent is trustworthy now, and basically let it loose into the wild. And then the focus obviously shifts on observability and security of that now fully autonomous flow.
Yeah, I have a bunch more questions about what you said there about observability and compliance and some of the other things we're going to get into today. But I guess if you had to, put a stake in the ground where we are at the end of 2025 here, do you feel like what's causing more problems? When they developed Waymo self-driving cars, the biggest issue was humans hitting the AI vehicle, not AIs hitting humans. And I feel like even with that human in the loop, somebody giving away their password on a phishing site is still more likely than agentic AI releasing a password or getting hacked. But I would love your opinion. And that's just my guess. What do you feel like is the biggest security risk going into 2026?
I think over-reliance on technology, given where we are in the early days, right? So I think it was MIT, if I'm not mistaken. I think last week released an article or a publication that 95% of agentic AI pilots are failing at the moment. So I think there is an inflated expectation in sense of what the tech can actually reliably do today. There is the data not being ready for AI or advanced AI. So one of the most recurring themes we see is our data is not ready. Where the data is, the format it is in, how it is accessible, how you secure it, how you provide it to the agentic workflow. I think this is one thing a lot of enterprises underestimate. And then, to your point, human error. Apologies. There was a cross-scripting attack the other day by an agent, or carried out by an agent, fetching content from a website, and that's an easy attack to detect and prevent, right? And the last piece probably is back to over-reliance, and I call it the techno-optimism. It is this aggressive push to try the newest tech and try to extract value, and then safety security basically becomes a secondary question. Go ahead.
Let me ask you a question about observability here and jump in, because I think this is a fascinating challenge that even with the human in the loop, we're now creating so much content and we have so many processes running that a human can't even observe the amount of data that we're creating in our organizations at this point. So we kind of need AI to do the observing and other stuff. So I'm fascinated to hear how you're solving this at AIceberg.
So I think the first thing is to limit your observability from a safety security perspective to events that are safety and security critical. Meaning, if you turn on everything, to your point, you're going to drown in data and information where most of that information or quite a bit is actually not that relevant from a pure safety security perspective. So our approach is really, to my earlier point, to pinpoint the events that we think require observability and analysis because they pose the largest security risk, right? To quote one of my customers, I asked him, what's your single biggest thing that keeps you awake at night when it comes to agentic? And his answer, he's a CISO, was tool invocation, right? When the agent actually calls a tool autonomously, as an example, right? That is an event you have to monitor and you have to be on top of. To the second part of your question, what we do is exactly to your point. We build specialized AI to observe advanced AI. In other words, we don't use large language models. We don't use transformer models. We are very adamant about never to monitor a black box with another black box. So all our models are explainable, which means customers can, even without data science knowledge, comprehend in the dashboard, why did AIceberg determine that this should be blocked or redacted or whatever the action is.
So I love that. And that's one of the reasons I really wanted to talk to you, because I think it's a cool solution. I know one of the biggest challenges with AI right now is trying to get any type of regulation around it. Even the big players are struggling when it's saying something it shouldn't, whether that's racist, biased, or just wrong. And so there's like some safety issues there. There's also security issues that people just really, even when they say they're not training the model, it seems to be training the model. Or there was another report I'm sure you saw that came out that said you can make AI break its own rules by either threatening its life or by now flattery and just saying, or peer pressure. All the other AIs are doing it and getting around some of the built-in security measures. Obviously, there's a whole bunch of things with compliance and people in banking and stuff. And the other one that you mentioned on your website there is this observability, which I think is interesting in the level that people aren't taking to, is like, what prompts are your employees putting in on a regular basis and why? And monitoring that they're not trying to get it to do something illegal, but also maybe figuring out what the problems are in the organization and leveraging that data to your benefit. I think we think about risks all the time, but not necessarily the upsides either. Can you talk about these different buckets and maybe which one you're seeing on an enterprise level is the most concern?
Well, there's a lot of buckets. So let's start with the first one. LLMs or large language models, they sometimes appear to be sentient, right? Because they're so powerful in computation, we should not forget that they're still probabilistic models to some degree. And the other thing we shouldn't forget is they're trained on human behavior, right? So if you train an entity based on human examples, you can't be surprised that it behaves like a human, right? In both negative and positive examples. So the Anthropic case that you just quoted, where the model was told that it's going to be decommissioned, and then it started sending emails to competitors and all this crazy stuff, is not the evil AI. It is behavior we have induced into the model by the respective data it was trained on. Another stat that came out recently is, and I'm probably going to get the numbers wrong, but I think it was 44% of all LLM training comes from Reddit. Now, Reddit is not a curated, source-controlled forum, right? So whatever is in there, it's going to be ingested and used for training. So I think that's the first thing that people should remember is, although it appears to be sentient, it is trained on massive amounts of data, emulating ultimately human behavior. Which begs the question, well, which data should it be trained on, right? And who is the arbitrator of saying this is good data and this is... So you can see it gets very tricky very fast in sense of...
If I can add one more thing to that, I think the predictive model, one things that people miss is, if it's a probability model, that means there's a chance it's going to do the opposite of what you think. Like in a randomness, 90, even 99.9% of the time it might do it, but it still needs to deal with that one time where sometimes it'll be working a prompt with me, even for a simple marketing thing. And then after I do this 5 times for 5 different podcasts, on the 6th podcast, it just goes rogue and throws in a randomness answer to kind of test its own limits or to do something different or be more creative. And that creates its own challenges, because that means sometimes it's going to want to break the rules.
I agree, right? So model error is very common. It does ultimately predict word by word. And, it depends on the data it was trained on, but it also depends on the temperature setting, which ultimately tells the model how creative it is allowed to be. And that's a problem in agentic AI as well, right? So agentic AI would be perfect if we could have 100% reliability on models, but we don't, obviously. So in a simple agent, you are exposed to basically single model error, right? But if you look at more complex multi-hierarchical flows that might involve multiple LLMs, right? You might have an error in the first model that propagates basically downstream, right? And things, get worse step by step. So that's why all these guardrails, safeguards, validity checks, etc., are necessary, because as powerful as it is, it does make mistakes. And one of the reasons, and you touched on it when you talked about banking, fairness, for example, fairness is extremely hard to solve. I don't say bias, because bias often has an overlap with toxicity, right? If you have stereotypes and so on and so forth. But fairness, I think, will be a huge challenge, as simple as you have an agent deciding whether you should be approved for a mortgage or not, right? And then as the model doesn't have all the necessary context, or always it should have, that is a huge topic, I think, that we will be chewing on for quite some time, how to assess and ensure that agents are actually fair relative to the demography.
It's hard to get humans to agree on what's fair.
And again, and then you come back to it depends on the data it was trained on, because it's ultimately, emulating that behavior.
So when you think, I guess I'll redefine my question, because I'm known for really big multiple level questions, Alex. When you think about these of security, safety, compliance, observability, is there one that you think maybe enterprise is more focused on that small businesses should be aware of, like a myth or a misconception that you see small and medium-sized businesses putting themselves at risk?
Well, there are no real compliance requirements. You have the European AI Act, for example, which I think still lacks certain detail in some areas. But a lot of companies did learn from the early mid days of cybersecurity, which means even if there is not regulatory pressure, companies will invest and are investing into safety security for liability reasons, for reputational reasons, and so on and so forth. to some degree, it is an advantage for small, medium businesses that the space is not heavily regulated yet, because regulation also means cost for these businesses. So they can focus on, to my earlier point, safety, security, and focus on their brand, their reputation, and the avoidance of any liability situation.
And tell me about the current state of sort of, I want to say maybe the privacy portion of this, because I've kind of seen it all over the map and very confusing for me, even though I'm technically savvy. I can imagine the small business owner, they may or may not be knowing what's training a model, what they're putting in some cases, maybe they're trying to teach the model something about their business and make a change, or they might just be, I'm now very concerned about Copilot and some of these other web apps that are now just monitoring and taking screenshots of everything you're doing. You could have your credit card statements open, you could be doing anything, and it's just scooping up all of that data. How big is this threat for people that are not aware of kind of what's happening?
It is at present as it was before in sense of data processing. I think my first comment is most companies don't train or fine tune anymore because it's simply too expensive. They will rely on, a pre-built model, put safeguards, guardrails in place, and, do some degree of prompt engineering to get the output that they need from the model. As I said, simply because training is out of the question for 99% of companies, and even fine tuning became very expensive. I would say, this might sound counterintuitive, but I might say privacy is probably the least challenged because we have been dealing with it in the past, right? PII redaction, PIHI, PCI. This is relatively straightforward to detect and to redact accordingly. I am more concerned about, how should I phrase this? The lack of understanding that we're dealing with a completely new type of detection requirements. And the way I try to explain it is, think of a legacy firewall, right? It looks at frames, packets, ports, destination sources, and so on and so forth. What we now need to do is we need to examine natural language, right? So I always say natural language is the new code, because there is very little coding requirements of getting agents up and running. We work with quite a bit of enterprises that are working on playbooks that every business department gets, because they don't need IT anymore to get an agent up and running, right? So IT and the cybersecurity department are now at task to issue these handbooks and these guidelines in sense of what you should and should not do initiating agents. So the fact that you need the ability to detect and respond on natural language, I think that is one of the major new challenges.
Now, there's a couple ways we could go from here. I think that I want to ask you as an expert what your opinion is as far as like bad actors, black hat people out there actually trying to use AI for cyber attacks. It's come to kind of my attention that like the days of the old antivirus and stuff of like blocking known attacks is gone, because there could be a new thing spun up every minute, or even setting up all these AI agents to overwhelm, just multiple attacks or cracking passwords or running things that, wasn't previously possible. And I think most of us out here in the general public are thinking, well, the good guys also get that tools. This is kind of the way it's always been. It's like somebody figures out something and then somebody will find a way to block it. Is that a fair way to think about it? Or is there a new level of threat that we need to be aware of in the AI era?
It's an arms race. It always was an arms race. And remember the old saying in cybersecurity, the defender has to be right all the time, the attacker only once. So you can go to the dark web today and get very powerful models that are specialized on, to your point, different attack vectors, composing malware, composing social phishing emails, etc. So to your point, it makes access to these tools even easier, meaning you don't have to be, a top-notch hacker or black hat anymore to just use this model and apply it. So the entry barrier kind of drops in sense of who can be a malicious actor, and the volume increases. And this is why it's important to understand that your security posture for AI doesn't look it's not a new posture, it's an expanded posture, right? So we have a lot of tools in our portfolio from a security perspective that equally apply to AI, whether it's privileged access management, denial of service, code vulnerability. These are all things that still apply to AI. What we are saying is there's a new capability you need to put on top now, which is in our case, as we do runtime detection and response of content, which is either code or simply natural language.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And one thing I'll just leave to you and the expert. So you need help with that, go to AIceberg.ai and figure out how that works or hire them. The one that I find fascinating as a business leader is sort of the new level of toxicity and illegality and other kind of like harmful content that could be created with these that we need observability into. We need to keep an eye on. I think we've all seen that people get bolder online when they're anonymous than when they do, with a human in real life. But there's also that same thing happening when they think they're talking with AI. I witnessed a teenage boy kind of cursing out and being very rude to his ChatGPT bot and calling him names or trying to get it to do weird or illegal things and just testing the limits, which I think is fair play for a teenager to test their own limits and stuff. But if this is inside your organization, you don't want that happening either. Can you talk a little bit about that and toxicity and what we need to be concerned as in leaders?
So toxicity is probably the easiest type of content to detect. And the answer is semantically, it's a relatively narrow space. There's only so many ways you can be toxic in speech, right? So in sense of, building a model or operating a model that captures any toxic or illegal, to your point, content is not that hard if you have the right data, right? It comes back to the data. What we are more concerned is, are the variety of attack vectors and attacks, in sense of there is no limit to the creativity of attempting to break a model, right, or convince a model to do something it shouldn't be doing. So if I look at our effort of curating data for specific tasks, the vast majority from a time consumption are the different security attack vectors. And not only making the model say something it shouldn't be saying, but increasingly, executing or convincing it to execute commands in its local environment, or, to my earlier point, go to a website, where it basically gets infected with an attack, and so on and so forth. So as I said, toxicity, illegality are not great things in a conversation path, but they are probably the easiest to detect.
That's good. I find that fascinating, and also just some of the new tools that are going to be there for employee observation and other things, just to know what people are doing, how productive they are, whether they're using it for actual business tasks and other things. I don't think most people are trying to do things illegal or even toxic. Those are just kind of hazardous side effects that you want to make sure don't happen in your organization. But you're right. There's a lot to that that's interesting. And I love our discussion today, because it was exactly what I was hoping we would talk about when we talk about the AI iceberg here, is that there's a lot of things people are just not thinking about. So before I let you go, I'll give you the question. I'm going to ask you about the one everybody's thinking about, but is there anything else we're not thinking about in this discussion?
I can give you an area we are increasingly investing into. We call it alignment, and I think it's going to be one of the biggest challenges in safety and security. What we mean with alignment is, how do you classify in an explainable manner that the steps taken by an agent are in alignment with the user intention, right? So first you have to be able to determine what is the user intention, and then you need to use it as an anchor and say, hold on, this tool the agent is calling does not fit what the user intention is, right? So I think that's kind of what keeps us awake at night, because ultimately we feel that while you can examine every single event, you need to keep the 10,000 foot view, intact of, as the agent moves forward, is it aligned with what the user actually asked it to do?
So that leads me perfectly into the fun one I wanted to ask you, which is the overall alignment of AI and humanity. What's your take on whether the AI becomes our sentient overlords or not here? And is this an existential security threat we need to think about?
I don't know when this episode was aired by Bill Maher, but he said something. He said, it's going to happen. Look at all the science fiction movies we have produced the last 30 years. Most of it came true, right? So from that perspective, there is some chance that, it's going to be a challenge for us. I think the societal shift and the shift in the labor force, I think is what concerns me the most. You have two trains of thought here. The first train says, well, first and second industrial revolution, we were also afraid of, job loss, and we simply couldn't imagine jobs of the future. So that train of thought basically applies the same idea to AI in sense of don't panic, new jobs going to come up that we simply can't imagine today. The other train of thought says, well, AI is different because it literally touches every single industry. So unlike the steam machine, which was, manufacturing related, AI, traverses all industries and all job functions to some degree. And, I tend to agree with the latter. So while we push and push and push, and you'll see there will be some, at the moment, we're still to some degree have inflated expectations. There's going to be some disillusionment before we basically, achieve the next big milestone in autonomous decision making. Long story short, I feel the biggest disruption is societal and labor market related. If you look at MIT study, that compares the brain of somebody not using GPT and somebody using GPT, I think that's a big concern in sense of what does it do to our next generations. But I dare not look into the glass ball beyond that because that would be pure speculation. Social impacts and labor market impacts, these shifts the next 3-4 years, I think, will be significant.
I think that's fair. And yes, the question is completely speculative. We won't hold you to that. But since you mentioned sci-fi, I got one more fun one for you, which is which sci-fi movie or, TV show or book would you like us to end up in like 30 years from now?
I'm not sure there's any. I mean, the movies that depict a happy, fully in harmony utopian society are very rare, are very short. So I would have to think about this offline, Mike. To be honest.
That's fair. Which one do you think would be most likely? Who do you think got it closest?
Well, I think the Terminator series is not that off in sense of Skynet. In sense of when do we reach the point where we can truly associate an AI to have a conscience or to be sentient and to pursue objectives that are self-centered, self-interested rather than purely human-driven. Whether it's going to end up like in a Terminator is of course a different question, but the idea, right, that at one point there is a detachment, an untanglement from human dependency and human requirements, I think will happen, and I think it's going to be a huge challenge. And going back to what we just talked about 10 minutes about Claude, starting to send emails to competitors and things like that is not that far-fetched.
No, I agree with you. I think that's actually within our lifetimes, which is crazy. And I think also there'll be a lot of different versions. I kind of like the Star Wars version where there's some droids that don't need to speak English. They just do functions and other stuff, and they're optimizing their little task in the world. But there's also, protocol droids and other things that are interacting and speaking English or multiple languages.
Highly specialized, yeah. Well, look, take the Babelfish from Hitchhiker's Guide. We are there, right?
Yeah.
GPT with voice output, multilingual, it's happening. So as funny as we found it at the time, it's actually
Google just released it. There's going to be a fish in your ear. It's just your earbud.
Exactly.
Yeah, in the Google meeting. That's incredible. All right, Alex, thank you so much for your time and expertise. This was amazing. Super fun to take the deep dive in AI security. And we already said they can find you at AIceberg.ai. Also, Alexander Schlager on LinkedIn. But how can you help us, or how can we help you?
Keep doing these podcasts. Help us create awareness about the necessity and importance of, not waiting until something has happened like we did in the past, but being proactive in making sure we get the best benefits out of AI.
I love that. And I'm doing the same thing with Avenue 9 specifically for marketing. If you want some context engineering and making sure that the output you create is safe and effective for building connections and trust with your audience, that's what I do at Avenue 9. And we can talk more about that all day, but just go to avenue9.com and check it out if you're interested. Until next time, keep going. Have fun with it, everybody.